The cantina on Kepler Prime was filled with smoke and the sound of alien voices talking in hushed tones. Zextel sat alone at a corner table, his 6 arms wrapped around a large cup of fermented kelp juice. His carapace bore the scars of 100 battles, but the deepest wounds were not visible on his chitinous exterior. They lived in his mind, in the memories that haunted his sleep cycles. The younger Coalition soldiers had been watching him all evening. They whispered among themselves, pointing at the legendary warrior who had fought in the human wars. Finally, one of them approached his table. The young Rexian scales were still bright green, unmarked by combat. "Commander Zextel," the soldier said with respect in his voice, "we have heard stories about you, about the battles you fought against the humans." Zextel looked up with his compound eyes, studying the young faces that had gathered around his table. They reminded him of himself long ago, when he believed in the Coalition's strength and the certainty of victory, before he learned what humans were truly capable of. "You want to hear about the Deathworld warriors," Zextel said, his voice like grinding metal. "You think it will be exciting stories of glory and honor." The soldiers nodded eagerly. One of them, a Keltorian with blue skin, leaned forward. "The Academy teaches us about human tactical doctrine, but they say you actually fought them face to face." Zextel's mandibles clicked together in what might have been laughter, but there was no humor in the sound. "The Academy teaches doctrine. I will tell you about nightmares." He took a long drink from his cup before continuing. 20 cycles ago, I was a squadron commander in the 5th Fleet. We received orders to investigate reports of human expansion into the Proxima system. High Command called it a routine patrol mission. They said the humans were primitive bipeds from a backwater planet. Their technology was inferior, their ships were crude, and their tactics were outdated. The young soldiers settled into their seats, eager to hear the tale. Zextel's eyes grew distant as he remembered those days when the Coalition believed itself invincible. Our intelligence reports showed that humans had established a small colony on Proxima 3, maybe 10,000 of them, living in basic shelters and mining asteroids with equipment that was centuries behind our own. The fleet. Admiral decided it would be a perfect training exercise for new crews. Send in a patrol squadron, demand surrender, accept their submission, and move on to more important targets. Zextel paused, his claws tapping against the metal table. The sound echoed through the cantina like the beating of war drums. I commanded 6 ships that day, heavy cruisers, each one carrying enough firepower to level a continent. We approached Proxima 3, expecting to find frightened colonists ready to beg for mercy. Instead, we found the Iron Thunder. The name hung in the air like a curse. Several of the younger soldiers had heard whispers of that ship, but none knew the full story. The Iron Thunder was a human cargo hauler that had been converted into a warship. It looked like scrap metal held together with prayer and desperation. Our sensors showed that it mounted weapons that were primitive by our standards, and its armor was barely thick enough to stop micrometeorites. Captain Jake Morrison commanded that vessel, and when we hailed him to demand surrender, do you know what he said? The soldiers shook their heads, hanging on every word. He said, "Come and take it." 3 words that should have been meaningless bravado from an outgunned enemy. But something in his voice made my scales crawl. There was no fear in those words, no desperation, just calm determination that spoke of absolute certainty. Zextel's voice dropped to a whisper, forcing the young soldiers to lean closer to hear. We opened fire with everything we had. 6 Coalition heavy cruisers against 1 converted cargo ship. The math was simple. The outcome was certain. The Iron Thunder should have been vaporized in the first salvo. He paused, remembering the moment when everything he believed about warfare changed forever. The human ship moved like nothing I had ever seen. Morrison threw his vessel into maneuvers that should have torn it apart. He used the gravity wells of nearby asteroids to slingshot around our firing solutions. When our plasma bursts missed their target, he was already somewhere else, dancing through space like a fighter instead of a lumbering cargo hauler. The Keltorian soldier interrupted. "But surely your superior numbers and firepower." "Superior firepower means nothing if you cannot hit your target," Zexthal cut him off. And Morrison was not content to simply evade our attacks. While we were trying to get a lock on his ship, he was hunting us. The veteran's compound eyes reflected the cantina's dim lighting as he continued his tale. The Iron Thunder carried mining charges, chemical explosives meant for breaking up asteroids. Morrison had modified them into torpedoes. When my flagship's shields were down for a microsecond during a weapon cycle, he put 3 of those crude bombs into our engine compartment. Zexthal gestured to a long scar that ran along his left side. The explosion threw me across the bridge. Half my crew was killed instantly. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was what happened next. The cantina had grown quiet around them. Other patrons had stopped their conversations to listen to the legendary warrior's story. While my ship was crippled and burning, Morrison could have finished us off. Any civilized warrior would have done exactly that. But humans do not think like civilized beings. Instead of destroying my ship, Morrison hailed us on an open channel. Zexthal's voice took on a haunted quality. He offered to let us withdraw if we promised never to return to human space. He said he did not want to kill anyone who did not need to die. This from a being whose species was supposedly primitive and barbaric. The young Brexian soldier looked confused. "That sounds almost merciful." "Merciful?" Zexthal's mandibles clicked rapidly. "You think it was mercy? Let me tell you what Jake Morrison really did that day. He showed us that humans do not follow the rules that govern warfare between civilized species. They make their own rules, and those rules change whenever it suits their purposes." The veteran took another drink before continuing. I accepted his offer because I had no choice. My ship was barely operational, and 2 of my other vessels had suffered significant damage from his unconventional attacks. We withdrew from Proxima 3, but not before Morrison sent us a final message. Zexthal's voice became barely audible. He said, "Tell your commanders that this was us being polite. Next time, we might not be in such a good mood." Then he laughed. He actually laughed as he watched 6 coalition warships retreat from a single converted cargo hauler. The silence stretched for long moments before one of the soldiers found his voice. "What happened to Morrison and the Iron Thunder?" Zexthal's eyes focused on the young warrior. That was just the beginning. Morrison and his crew fought in 17 more engagements over the next 2 cycles. They were finally destroyed at the Battle of Ross 128, but not before they had taken out 23 coalition vessels and inspired other humans to follow their example. The veteran rose from his chair, his scarred carapace catching the light. "You wanted to hear about the human wars. That was my first lesson in what we were truly facing. Not primitive barbarians who would surrender at the first show of force, but beings who had turned desperation into an art form and who treated impossible odds as merely another tactical challenge to overcome." As Zexthal prepared to leave, the young Vrexian called after him, "Commander, will you tell us more tomorrow?" The old warrior looked back at the eager faces surrounding him. "Tomorrow I will tell you about New Dallas, and you will understand why we began to fear not just human ships, but human colonies. You will learn why the mere mention of Colonial Defense Commander Lisa Brooks still gives me nightmares." With that, Zexthal walked into the shadows, leading behind a group of young soldiers who were beginning to understand that the human wars had been unlike any conflict in galactic history. The next evening found the same group of young Coalition soldiers waiting at Zexthiel's usual table. Word had spread through the station about the veterans' stories, and tonight there were twice as many listeners crowded around the corner of the cantina. The old warrior appeared precisely at the same time, carrying his customary cup of fermented kelp juice. "You came back," he observed, settling into his chair with the careful movements of someone whose body had been broken and rebuilt too many times. "You promised to tell us about New Dallas," the young Vrexian reminded him. Zexthiel's compound eyes swept across the assembled faces. He saw curiosity and excitement, but also the beginning of something else. Yesterday's story had planted seeds of doubt about human capabilities, and those seeds were starting to grow. New Dallas, he repeated, the name tasting bitter in his mouth. 6 months after the Proxima incident, High Command decided that individual human ships were anomalies. They believed that human colonies would be easy targets. Civilian populations do not fight like soldiers, after all. The veteran's claws drummed against the table as he gathered his thoughts. New Dallas was a farming colony on the 4th planet of the Kepler 442 system. 50,000 humans living in a collection of domes and underground facilities. They grew food crops in artificial soil and raised livestock in controlled environments. From orbit, it looked like any other peaceful settlement. Zexthiel paused to take a long drink. The Coalition assembled a proper invasion force this time. 30 ships carrying 50,000 troops. We had orbital bombardment capability, atmospheric fighters, and enough ground forces to occupy a dozen worlds. The plan was simple: demand surrender, and if they refused, demonstrate our superior firepower until they saw reason. A Kultorian. Officer leaned forward. What went wrong? Everything, Zexthiel replied, starting with our first communication with Colonial Defense Commander Lisa Brooks. The name was spoken with the kind of respect usually reserved for legendary warriors or natural disasters. Brooks was a former military engineer who had retired to New Dallas to start a family. She had 2 young children and a husband who taught agricultural science. When we hailed the colony and demanded their surrender, she appeared on our screens wearing a simple work uniform with dirt under her fingernails. Zexthiel's voice took on the cadence of someone reciting a nightmare. She listened to our demands with perfect calm. No fear, no anger, just the quiet attention of someone receiving important information. When our commander finished his speech about the futility of resistance, Brooks nodded politely and said, "Thank you for the warning. We decline your offer." The assembled soldiers stirred uneasily. They had all been taught that civilian populations would surrender rather than face military action. Our commander tried to explain the situation more clearly. He told Brooks about our superior numbers and advanced technology. He described what would happen to our colony if they chose to resist. She listened to all of this with the same calm attention, then asked a single question. Zexthiel's eyes grew distant as he remembered that moment. She asked, "Are you planning to leave any of us alive when this is over?" Our commander was confused by the question. He explained that civilians who surrendered peacefully would be relocated to designated zones where they could continue their lives under Coalition oversight. The veteran's mandibles clicked together in that humorless laugh. Brooks smiled when she heard that. It was not a pleasant expression. She said, "In that case, we have nothing to lose by fighting." Then she cut the transmission. A young Vrexian officer looked puzzled. "I do not understand. If surrender meant survival, you think like a Coalition citizen," Zexthiel interrupted. "Humans do not view survival under occupation the same way we do. To them, freedom and life are the same thing. Take away one, and the other becomes meaningless." The old warrior continued his tale. "We began with a limited orbital bombardment. targeting what appeared to be military installations and communication arrays. But every structure we destroyed had been evacuated hours before. Brooks had anticipated our tactics and moved her people. Underground, Zexthel gestured with one of his upper arms. New Dallas had been built on top of a natural cave system that the humans had expanded into a vast underground network. Miles of tunnels connected every building to every other building. They had spent years turning their peaceful colony into a fortress, and we never suspected. The cantina had grown quiet again as other patrons strained to hear the story. When orbital bombardment failed to break the resistance, we landed ground forces. 50,000 coalition troops against 50,000 human civilians. The odds seemed acceptable. The veteran's voice dropped to a whisper. The first wave of our troops landed near the main colony dome. They found empty streets and abandoned buildings. No resistance, no defenders, just an eerie silence that made everyone nervous. Then the explosions started. Zexthel paused, his scarred carapace reflecting the cantina's lighting. The humans had booby-trapped everything. Streets, buildings, vehicles, even individual rooms had been rigged with improvised explosives. Not sophisticated military ordnance, but crude bombs made from fertilizer and mining equipment. Every step our troops took might trigger a blast that would kill or maim dozens of soldiers. A Keltorian soldier shook his head in disbelief. Civilians do not have access to military explosives. Humans do not need military explosives, Zexthel replied. They make their own from whatever materials are available. Lisa Brooks was an engineer, and she had taught every adult in the colony how to build bombs from household chemicals. The veteran's voice took on a haunted quality. But the explosives were just the beginning. Once our troops spread out to search, the colony, the real fighting started. Humans would appear from tunnels and sewers, attack our forces with weapons that should not have existed, then disappear back underground before we could respond. Zexthel held up one of his clawed hands. A 10-year-old human child killed 3 of my soldiers with a crossbow made from construction materials. An elderly human female, at least 70 years old, used a modified agricultural sprayer to cover. An entire squad with acid that ate through their armor. These were not soldiers. They were farmers and teachers and shopkeepers who had been transformed into the most dangerous guerrilla fighters I have ever encountered. The assembled officers exchanged uncomfortable glances. This was not the kind of warfare they had been trained to expect. The siege lasted for 4 months. Every day brought new horrors as the humans found more creative ways to kill coalition troops. They used the colony's life support systems as weapons, flooding areas with poisonous gas or extreme temperatures. They hacked into our communications and fed us false information that led entire units into carefully prepared ambushes. Zexthel's compound eyes focused on a young Vrexian. By the end of the 2nd month, my troops were afraid to enter any building, afraid to walk down any street, afraid to trust any piece of equipment they found. The humans had turned their entire colony into a weapon, and we were bleeding soldiers. Every hour of every day. The veteran took another long drink before continuing. Then Captain Ryan Kelly arrived with the civilian fleet. A name was spoken with the same reverence given to legendary warriors. Kelly commanded a collection of cargo haulers, passenger transports, and mining vessels that had been converted into warships. 43 ships crewed by volunteers who had no formal military training, but who fought with the desperation of people defending their homes. Zexthel's voice grew stronger as he described the space battle. Our orbital fleet should have destroyed Kelly's ragtag squadron without difficulty. But the humans had learned from Jake Morrison's tactics. They used unconventional maneuvers, improvised weapons, and most importantly, they were willing to sacrifice themselves to achieve their objectives. The old warrior gestured toward the ceiling. Kelly's ship, the Free Texas, was a converted grain hauler that should not have been able to fight a military engagement. But Kelly had packed it with every piece of military hardware he could find, and crewed it with farmers who had been practicing combat maneuvers in their spare time. Zextul's mandibles clicked rapidly as he remembered the battle. The Free Texas took on our flagship in single combat, while the rest of Kelly's fleet engaged our escort vessels. Kelly's crew fought their ship like madmen, accepting damage that would have forced any sane commander to surrender, while continuing to return fire with weapons that had been jury-rigged from mining equipment. The veteran's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The end came when pilot Amy Carter volunteered for a suicide mission. She flew her fighter directly into our command ship's bridge, destroying our ability to coordinate the orbital bombardment. The explosion killed her instantly, but it gave the colonists the opening they needed. Zextul looked around at the silent faces surrounding him. While we were dealing with the chaos in orbit, Lisa Brooks led the entire population of New Dallas through the tunnel system to a hidden spaceport they had been building for months. 50,000 humans disappeared into the underground network and emerged 20 miles away, where hidden transports were waiting to evacuate them. The old warriors. Voice took on a tone of grudging respect. The third night brought an even larger crowd to the cantina. Word of Zextul's stories had spread throughout Kepler Prime, and beings from a dozen different species had come to hear the legendary warrior's tales of the human wars. The old veteran appeared at his usual time, but tonight his movements seemed even more labored than before, as if the weight of his memories was growing heavier with each telling. "You have been spreading my stories," he observed, noting the crowd that had gathered around his corner table. "The whole station wants to hear about the humans," the young Rexian admitted. "Your tales are unlike anything in the official military histories." Zextul settled into his chair and studied the faces surrounding him. He saw fear beginning to replace curiosity in some eyes, while others still burned with the excitement of hearing war stories. By the time he finished tonight's tale, that excitement would be gone. "Titan Station," he began, and several beings in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. The name was whispered in the darkest corners of Coalition military facilities, spoken of only in hushed tones by veterans who had been there. After New Dallas, High Command decided that human colonies were too dangerous to assault directly. The new strategy was to capture their research facilities and industrial centers, places that would be lightly defended by scientists and engineers instead of trained fighters. The veteran's compound eyes reflected the cantina's lighting as he continued. Titan Station orbited Saturn in the Sol system. It was a research facility with a crew of 50 humans, studying gas giant atmospheric dynamics and developing new propulsion technologies. Intelligence reports indicated minimal defensive capabilities and no military personnel. It seemed like the perfect target for a surgical strike. Zextul's claws tapped against the table in a rhythm that sounded like a funeral march. "I led the assault force personally. 300 Coalition elite troops, the best fighters in the galaxy. We approached Titan Station, expecting to find frightened scientists ready to surrender at the first sign of military force." The old warrior paused to take a drink, his movements deliberate and slow. Dr. Nathan Ford was the station's chief scientist. He had spent 20 years studying exotic matter and energy manipulation theories that most species considered purely theoretical. When we hailed the station and demanded surrender, Ford appeared on our communication screen wearing a simple laboratory coat with coffee stains on the front. Zextul's voice took on the flat tone of someone reciting facts that still seemed impossible. Ford listened to our demands with the polite attention of someone receiving a minor interruption to their work schedule. When our commander finished explaining the futility of resistance, Ford nodded thoughtfully and said, "That is very interesting. Unfortunately, I am in the middle of some rather important experiments, and I really cannot be disturbed right now." "Eh?" Kaltorian officer in the crowd spoke up. Surely he was bluffing. 50 scientists against 300 elite soldiers? That is what we thought, Sexthul replied. Ford seemed to understand our confusion because he continued talking. He said, I should probably mention that we have spent the last few months turning this station into what you might call a practical demonstration of applied physics principles. I do hope you will find it educational. The veterans' mandibles clicked together in that humorless sound. Our troops docked with the station and began boarding procedures. The airlocks opened without resistance, and we found ourselves in corridors that looked exactly like what you would expect from a research facility. Clean, well-lit, filled with scientific equipment and comfortable furniture. Zexthul's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The first sign that something was wrong came when Sergeant Vrexenar tried to check a side corridor. He took 3 steps and suddenly found himself walking on the ceiling. The humans had modified their gravity. Generators to create localized fields that could be triggered remotely. The old warrior gestured with one of his upper arms. While Vrexenar was trying to figure out how to get back to the floor, the corridor walls began closing in on him. Not quickly, but with the steady, inevitable pressure of a machine that would not stop until it completed its programmed function. The cantina had grown completely silent. Even the background noise of other conversations had faded as everyone strained to hear the story. We managed to extract Vrexenar before the walls crushed him, but that was just the beginning. Every corridor in Titan Station had been turned into a death trap. The humans had weaponized their own life support systems, using air recycling vents to flood areas with sleeping gas or toxic fumes. They had reprogrammed maintenance robots to attack anyone wearing Coalition armor. Zexthul's voice took on a haunted quality. But the worst part was the humans themselves. They moved through the station like ghosts, appearing and disappearing, through service tunnels and emergency passages that we did not even know existed. Security Chief Maria Santos led a team of researchers who had trained for months to fight in zero-gravity environments. The veterans' compound eyes focused on a point somewhere beyond the cantina walls. Santos and her people would strike at our forces and then vanish into the station's ventilation system. They used magnetic boots to walk on walls and ceilings, attacking from angles that our soldiers never expected. When we tried to follow them into the air ducts, we found that the humans had filled them with obstacles and traps. A young Rexian soldier looked confused. How could researchers and scientists fight trained military personnel? Because they knew every inch of their station better than we knew our own ships, Zexthul replied. Santos had spent 2 years studying the station's layout and had trained her people to use every system as a weapon. They turned their research equipment into improvised guns, their experimental materials into explosives, and their knowledge of physics into tactical advantages. We could not counter. The old warrior took another long drink before continuing. The station's computer systems had been reprogrammed to respond only to human commands. Every time we tried to access a terminal or override a security lock, the computers would trigger some new trap or defensive measure. Engineer Pete Collins had spent months writing code that would turn the station itself into an opponent. Zexthul's voice grew stronger as he described the escalating conflict. By the second day of the assault, we had lost 60 soldiers to traps, ambushes, and what the humans called environmental hazards. Our troops were afraid to touch anything, afraid to enter any room, afraid to trust their own equipment because the humans had somehow learned to hack our communication systems. The veteran's mandibles clicked rapidly as he remembered the frustration and growing terror. Dr. Ford would appear on our screens every few hours to offer helpful commentary on our progress. He would explain the scientific principles behind whatever. Trap had just killed more of our soldiers, speaking with the enthusiasm of a teacher discussing a particularly interesting experiment. Zexthel's voice dropped to a whisper. The breaking point came on the third day. We had finally managed to corner a group of humans in the station's main laboratory. They were trapped with no way to escape, and we had overwhelming numerical superiority. Victory was certain. The old warrior paused, his scarred carapace catching the light. That was when Pete Collins activated what Ford called the final demonstration. The station's power core began overloading in a cascade reaction that would destroy everything within a 50-mile radius. Collins appeared on our communication screens and calmly explained that the humans had rigged their entire station to explode. The cantina was so quiet that the sound of breathing was audible. Collins gave us exactly 10 minutes to evacuate our forces and withdraw to a safe distance. He was not negotiating or making demands. He was simply providing us with the technical specifications for a bomb that would kill everyone aboard the station, human and coalition alike. Zexthel's compound eyes swept across the assembled faces. Our commander tried to call Collins' bluff. He ordered our troops to continue the assault, believing that the humans would not actually detonate their own station. Collins listened too. This decision with the same polite attention that Ford had shown to our initial surrender demands. The veteran's voice became barely audible. Then Collins said something that still haunts my dreams. He said, "I understand your confusion, but you seem to have misunderstood the situation. This is not a threat or a negotiating tactic. This is simply us informing you that everyone on this station is going to die in approximately 9 minutes and 30 seconds. You can choose to be somewhere else when that happens, or you can choose to die with us. We are perfectly comfortable with either option." The old warrior looked around at the silent faces surrounding him. The humans were completely calm about the prospect of mutual destruction. They had accepted their own deaths with the same casual attitude that most beings reserve for discussing the weather. Collins actually wished us well and hoped that our deaths would be quick and painless. Zexthel's voice took on a tone of grudging respect mixed with terror. We evacuated. 300 elite coalition troops retreated from 50 human scientists because we finally understood that the humans were not bluffing. They were genuinely prepared to die rather than surrender, and they were equally prepared to take us with them. The fourth night found the cantina packed beyond capacity. Beings from across the station had come to hear Zexthel's stories, and many more waited outside, hoping to catch fragments of the tale through the open doorways. The old veteran appeared, precisely on schedule, but tonight he carried himself with the bearing of someone preparing to relive his worst nightmare. "Tonight you want to hear about Wolf 359, he said without preamble, his compound eyes scanning the crowd that pressed in around his table. "You want to know about the greatest fleet engagement in coalition history, and why it ended with our forces retreating from what should have been an easy victory." The veteran settled into his chair with the careful movements of someone whose body had been shattered and rebuilt too many times to count. After Titan Station, High Command decided that individual targets were too dangerous to assault. The new strategy was to engage the human fleet in open space, where our superior numbers and technology would give us an overwhelming advantage. No traps, no environmental hazards, just ship against ship in honest combat. Zexthel's claws droned against the table in a pattern that sounded like weapons fire. The Coalition assembled the largest fleet in our history for the Battle of Wolf. 359, 800 warships carrying the finest crews from a dozen different species. We had battleships that could crack planets, cruisers that moved faster than light itself, and fighters that could dance between asteroid fields while firing weapons that could melt through any known armor. The old warrior paused to study the faces surrounding him. Admiral Kate Williams commanded the human fleet. Intelligence reports described her as a former cargo ship captain who had been promoted beyond her abilities, due to the humans' desperate need for experienced commanders. She had never attended a military academy, never studied advanced tactical theory, never commanded anything larger than a freight convoy. Zexthel's mandibles clicked together in that familiar, humorless sound. Williams appeared on our communication screens when the two fleets met in the Wolf 359 system. She was a small human female with gray hair and tired eyes, wearing a uniform that looked like it had been slept in. When our fleet admiral demanded her surrender, she listened with the polite attention we had learned to fear from other human commanders. The veteran's voice took on the flat tone he used when describing impossible events. Williams thanked our admiral for his offer and politely declined. Then she did something that had never happened in the history of galactic warfare. She transmitted her complete battle plan to every ship in both fleets, coalition and human alike. A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd. Several officers exchanged bewildered glances. Williams explained her strategy in detail, describing exactly how she intended to defeat our superior force. She showed us her planned movements, her target priorities, even the specific weaknesses in our formations that she intended to exploit. Then she wished us good luck and signed off. Zexthel's compound eyes focused on a young Vrexian in the front row. Our tactical computers analyzed Williams' plan within minutes. Every coalition commander could see exactly what the humans intended to do, and our response was obvious. We adjusted our formations to counter their strategy, repositioned our ships to eliminate the weaknesses Williams had identified, and prepared to demonstrate why military academies exist. The old warrior's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. That was when we learned that Kate Williams had not been sharing her battle plan with us. She had been sharing her mate. The cantina fell completely silent. Even the ambient noise from the corridor outside seemed to fade as everyone strained to hear the story. The human fleet moved exactly as Williams had promised. They executed every maneuver she had described, attacked every target she had identified, and walked directly into every trap we had prepared for them. Our superior firepower and tactical positioning should have destroyed them within the first hour. Zexthel paused, his scarred carapace reflecting the dim lighting. Instead, we found ourselves fighting an enemy that had somehow anticipated our responses to their own strategy. Every trap we set was countered by a human ship that appeared in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. Every tactical advantage we gained was neutralized by maneuvers that should have been impossible to coordinate. The veteran's voice took on a tone of reluctant admiration mixed with terror. Williams had given us her real plan, but she had also given her own commanders something we did not understand at the time. She had taught them to think like humans instead of like military officers. Every human captain was prepared to sacrifice their ship, their crew, and themselves to achieve objectives that made no sense according to conventional tactical doctrine. Zexthel gestured with one of his upper arms. Lieutenant Commander Steve Parker commanded a destroyer called the Defiant Spirit. When coalition battleships surrounded his vessel and demanded surrender, Parker did something that violated every principle of naval warfare. He powered down his shields and opened his weapon ports, making his ship completely vulnerable to enemy fire. The old warrior's mandibles clicked rapidly as he remembered the moment. Our commanders thought Parker was surrendering, so they held their fire and prepared to accept his submission. Instead, Parker used the power from his shield generators to overcharge his weapon systems and fired everything he had at point-blank range into our flagship's engine compartment. Zexthel's voice grew stronger as he described the impossible battle. The Defiant Spirit was destroyed instantly by return fire from our escort vessels. But Parker's sacrifice crippled our command ship and threw our entire formation into chaos. While we were trying to restore order, Williams launched the second phase of her attack. The veteran looked around at the faces surrounding him. seeing the mixture of fascination and horror that had become familiar over the past 3 nights. Human ships began ramming our vessels at full speed, not as acts of desperation, but as carefully planned tactical maneuvers. Captain Helen Davis led a squadron of converted cargo haulers in suicide attacks against our heavy cruisers, using their reinforced hulls as weapons that could penetrate any armor. Zextul's compound eyes grew distant as he remembered the carnage. Davis commanded a ship called the New Frontier, a grain hauler that had been packed with explosives and crewed by volunteers who knew they were flying to their deaths. She broadcast a message on all frequencies as she made her attack run, singing some kind of human war song while her ship burned around her. The old warrior's voice became barely audible. The New Frontier struck our battleship dominant victory, amidships, and detonated with enough force to crack the larger vessel in half. Davis and her crew were vaporized instantly, but they took 800 coalition personnel with them and eliminated our most powerful warship from the battle. The cantina was so quiet that individual heartbeats were audible in the silence. But the ramming attacks were just a distraction from William's real objective. While we were dealing with suicide ships and trying to maintain formation integrity, human fighters were infiltrating our defensive perimeter using tactics that should have been impossible. Zextul's voice took on the tone of someone describing a fever dream. Human pilots flew their fighters through debris fields created by destroyed ships, using the wreckage as cover while they approached our capital vessels. They accepted losses that would have broken any other species' morale, with entire squadrons sacrificing themselves to get a single fighter close enough to target critical systems. The veteran gestured toward his scarred carapace. Pilot Jenny. Martinez flew her fighter directly into the bridge of my flagship while I was standing 10 feet from the impact point. The explosion threw me across the command deck and left me unconscious for 3 days. When I woke up, the battle was over and the coalition fleet was in full retreat. A young Keltorian officer found his voice. How could the humans coordinate such complex tactics without communication? That was the most terrifying part, Zextul replied. They did not need to communicate because they all understood William's true strategy. Every human commander knew that their job was not to survive or achieve individual glory, but to inflict maximum damage on coalition forces, regardless of the cost to themselves. The old warrior's mandibles clicked together as he continued. Williams had trained her fleet to fight like a single organism instead of individual ships. When one vessel was destroyed, the others adapted instantly to fill the gap. When a tactical situation changed, human commanders responded without waiting for orders, because they already knew what needed to be done. Zextul's voice dropped too. A whisper. Near the end of the battle, William's own flagship was surrounded by coalition vessels and taking heavy damage. Our commanders demanded her surrender, offering to spare her crew if she would order the remaining human ships to stand down. The veteran paused, his compound eyes reflecting the cantina's lighting. Williams appeared on our screens one final time, her uniform torn and her face covered with blood from injuries sustained when her bridge was hit. She listened to our demands with that same polite attention we had learned to dread, then smiled and said something that still gives me nightmares. Old Warrior looked around at the silent faces surrounding him. The 5th night brought the largest crowd yet to the cantina. Word of Zextul's final story had spread throughout Kepler Prime and beyond, with beings traveling from other stations just to hear the conclusion of his tales. The old veteran appeared at his usual time, but tonight he moved with the deliberate pace of someone carrying an enormous burden. Tonight you want to hear about the end, he said, settling into his chair with a finality that made the assembled crowd shift uncomfortably. You want to know why the coalition chose to negotiate with humans instead of continuing a war we could have won through sheer numbers and superior technology. The veteran's compound eyes swept across the sea of faces surrounding him, seeing representatives from dozens of species who had never known what it meant to fear an enemy. After Wolf 359, High Command spent 6 months analyzing what had gone wrong. The tactical computers ran thousands of simulations, trying to understand how the humans had achieved such devastating results with inferior forces. The answer they provided was both simple and terrifying. Zexthul paused to take what everyone knew would be his final drink at this table. The humans had not been trying to win individual battles. They had been trying to teach us that victory against their species would cost more than any civilization could afford to pay. Every engagement had been a lesson in the price of conquest, and we had been too arrogant to understand what they were trying to tell us. The old warrior's claws drummed against the table in a pattern that sounded like distant thunder. High Command decided that the only solution was overwhelming force. If humans fought with such ferocity because they believed they could win, then we would demonstrate the futility of resistance by deploying every ship, every soldier, and every weapon in the coalition arsenal. Zexthul's voice took on the flat tone he used when describing impossible events. The Grand Fleet assembled at Rigel contained over 2,000 warships from 17 different species. It was the largest military force in galactic history, carrying enough firepower to sterilize 100 worlds. Our objective was simple: the complete conquest of human space and the elimination of their species as a military threat. The veterans' mandibles clicked together in that familiar, humorless sound. As we prepared for the final assault, coalition diplomats approached the human government with an ultimatum: surrender unconditionally, accept relocation to designated worlds under coalition supervision, and agree to complete disarmament. In exchange, we would guarantee the survival of their civilian population. Zexthul's compound eyes focused on a point somewhere beyond the cantina walls. The human response came from Ambassador Tony Martinez, a former cargo pilot who had become their chief diplomatic representative. Martinez appeared on our communication screens, wearing a simple business suit and speaking with the calm professionalism of someone discussing a minor trade dispute. The old warrior's voice grew stronger as he remembered that moment. Martinez thanked our diplomats for their generous offer and politely declined. Then he said something that changed the course of galactic history. He said, "We appreciate your desire to avoid unnecessary bloodshed, but we should probably clarify a few things about the current military situation." The cantina had grown completely silent, with even the background noise from the corridor outside fading to nothing. Martinez explained that everything we had fought so far had been what humans called their colonial defense forces: volunteers, reservists, and local militias, equipped with whatever weapons they could improvise or purchase from civilian sources. The actual human navy had been held in reserve, waiting to see if the coalition could be discouraged through defensive actions alone. Zexthul's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Our intelligence services had spent years cataloging human military capabilities, and we believed we had identified every ship, every base, and every weapon in their arsenal. Martinez politely informed us that our intelligence was incomplete by a factor of approximately 10 to 1. The veteran's scarred carapace caught the light as he continued. The humans had been building their real military force in complete secrecy, using manufacturing facilities hidden in asteroid belts and gas giant atmospheres, while we had been fighting converted cargo haulers and improvised weapons. They had been constructing a fleet of purpose-built warships crewed by professional soldiers who had trained for years specifically to fight coalition forces. A young Vrexian officer found his voice. Surely that was a bluff. No species could hide military construction on such a scale. That is what we thought, Zexthul replied. Martinez seemed to understand our skepticism because he provided us with detailed technical specifications for human military vessels we had never seen before. Ships with armor that could absorb direct hits from our heaviest weapons, engines that could outrun our fastest interceptors, and weapons based on physics principles that our scientists insisted were impossible. The old warrior's voice took on a haunted quality. But the technical specifications were not the most disturbing part of Martinez's presentation. He also provided us with tactical assessments, showing exactly how human forces would respond to our planned invasion. Every strategy we had developed, every contingency we had prepared for, every advantage we thought we possessed had been analyzed and countered. Zexthal looked around at the silent faces surrounding him. Martinez explained that humans had spent the entire war studying coalition tactics, technology, and psychology. They knew our formations better than we did, understood our equipment better than our own engineers, and had developed specific countermeasures for every weapon system in our arsenal. The veteran's mandibles clicked rapidly as he remembered the growing horror of that revelation. Then Martinez introduced us to General Claire Thompson, the commander of human military forces. Thompson was a small human female with gray hair and the kind of calm, professional demeanor that we had learned to associate with impending disaster. Zexthal's voice became barely audible. Thompson thanked us for providing such excellent training opportunities during the colonial defense phase of the conflict. She explained that human military doctrine required extensive field testing of tactics and equipment, and our attacks on their colonies had provided invaluable data for improving their combat effectiveness. The old warrior paused, his compound eyes reflecting the cantina's dim lighting. Thompson told us that the human navy was prepared to begin offensive operations immediately. Not raids or defensive actions, but a systematic campaign to eliminate coalition military capabilities throughout the galaxy. She provided us with target lists showing every major coalition base, shipyard, and industrial facility, along with detailed attack plans for neutralizing each one. The cantina was so quiet that individual breathing patterns were audible in the silence. But the most terrifying part of Thompson's presentation was her casualty projections. She had calculated the exact cost of conquering human space, down to the last ship and soldier. According to her analysis, the coalition would need to commit 90% of our total military forces for a minimum of 50 years to achieve complete victory. Zexthal's voice took on a tone of grudging respect mixed with absolute terror. Thompson explained that humans were prepared to fight that kind of war. They had built their entire civilization around the assumption that survival might require generations of continuous conflict. Every human colony was a fortress. Every civilian was a potential soldier, and every piece of technology was designed to be converted into a weapon at a moment's notice. The veteran rose from his chair, his movements stiff with old injuries and the weight of terrible memories. Then Thompson smiled, and that expression contained more menace than all the weapons in the coalition arsenal. She said, "Of course, we would prefer to avoid such an unpleasant conflict. We are prepared to offer you the same terms you offered us: complete withdrawal from human space, acceptance of our territorial sovereignty, and a mutual non-aggression pact." Zexthal looked down at the crowd of silent, stunned faces. High Command spent 3 days analyzing Thompson's presentation. Our best strategists confirmed that her projections were accurate, and our intelligence services verified that the hidden human facilities were real. The choice was simple: accept human terms or face a war that would destroy both civilizations. The old warrior's voice took on a tone of finality. The Treaty of Centauri was signed 6 months later. The coalition agreed to recognize human independence, withdraw all forces from human space, and establish formal diplomatic relations. In exchange, humans agreed not to expand beyond their current borders and to limit their military activities to defensive operations. Zexthal began moving toward the exit and stopped and looked back at the crowd one final time. That was 20 years ago. Since then, humans have honored every provision of the treaty, while continuing to build their civilization according to their own principles. They remain the only species in the galaxy that the Coalition has never conquered, and they achieve that distinction not through superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but through absolute determination to remain free. The Veterans Compound. Eyes swept across the assembled faces one last time.